My name is Courtney Bennett. I'm 33, and I live just outside Nashville. That Sunday dinner in November 2024, my brother Blake brought his new girlfriend to the table, looked straight at me with that familiar smirk, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is the failure of our family." My parents burst out laughing like it was the funniest joke they'd heard all year. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, feeling the heat crawl up my face. Across the table, my younger sister Hailey hadn't said a single word all night. She just watched, calm as ever. Then she put her glass down, smiled the smallest smile I'd ever seen, and answered in a voice so quiet it somehow filled the entire room. "Interesting. Because at this very moment I am locking the door reserved for all of you, and it will never open again." If you've ever been laughed at by the people who are supposed to love you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You're not going to believe what happened next. That Sunday evening in November 2024 finally brought everyone back to the same table for the first time in over 2 years. The house still smelled like Mom's pot roast and the same old candles she always lit when company came over, but the air felt thick, like nobody really wanted to be there. My parents sat at the ends of the long oak table they'd had since we were kids. My older brother Blake Bennett, 36, and dressed in the same navy blazer he wore to every family thing, kept one arm around his new girlfriend, Brooke Harrison. My younger sister Hailey Bennett, 29, sat directly across from me and hadn't said a word since she walked in. Dad cleared his throat and started right in on how proud he was that Blake had just gotten another raise at the bank. Mom jumped in with the details, how he was now regional sales director, how the branch in Franklin was beating every target, how they were even talking about another promotion before the end of the year. Every sentence ended with a smile aimed straight at Blake, like the rest of us were just background. Brooke leaned into him, laughing a little too loud at everything he said, touching his arm every few seconds. She kept calling him babe and telling Mom how lucky she was to have such a successful son. Mom ate it up, nodding and beaming like this was the first time she'd heard any of it. Then the questions turned to me. Dad asked, casual as ever, how the little online store was doing, putting air quotes around the words, like it was still some hobby I'd started in high school. Mom chimed in, asking if I'd thought any more about going back to college, because Blake's friends from the bank are always looking for smart people. Brooke tilted her head with this fake sweet smile and asked if I ever got tired working from home all day in pajamas. They all laughed soft at first, then louder, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my face get hot, but I just forced a smile and said, "Business was fine. Thanks for asking." Hailey still hadn't touched her water. She sat perfectly straight, eyes moving slowly from face to face, taking it all in without a single blink. Blake leaned back in his chair, swirling the beer Dad had handed him the second he walked in, and started talking about the new truck he was thinking of leasing, how the interest rates were finally coming down, and how his credit was perfect. Mom practically glowed. Dad slapped the table lightly and said that was exactly why hard work paid off. Brooke squeezed Blake's hand and told me not even trying to whisper that maybe one day I'd figure that out too. The food kept getting passed around, but nobody was really eating anymore. The conversation stayed on Blake, his bonuses, his golf game with the regional VP, the vacation he and Brooke were planning to Destin next spring. Every time I tried to say anything, someone talked over me or changed the subject back to him. I caught Hailey looking at me once. Her expression hadn't changed, but there was something different in her eyes, something sharp and steady that made me stop talking mid-sentence. By the time Mom brought out dessert, the smiles had started to feel practiced, the laughter a little forced. Dad poured himself another glass of tea and asked Brooke how she liked Nashville so far. She launched into a story about some rooftop bar downtown, and Blake laughed like he'd never heard it before, even though I'd seen the exact same post on his Instagram last week. Hailey finally picked up her fork again and took one slow bite of mashed potatoes. That was the only sound for a few seconds, just the scrape of metal on china. Nobody seemed to notice except me. Right after Mom set the peach cobbler on the table, Blake leaned back and draped his arm over the back of Brooke's chair. He turned to her with that half smirk he's had since middle school, the one that always meant trouble was coming, and said loud and clear so nobody could pretend they didn't hear. "This is the failure of our family." Brooke threw her head back and laughed like he'd just told the best punchline of the night. Mom covered her mouth, but the laugh still slipped out sharp and quick. Dad gave that low chuckle he saves for when Blake says something edgy, shaking his head like it was all in good fun. I felt every pair of eyes land on me at once. My fork was still in my hand, halfway to my mouth, gravy dripping onto the tablecloth. Heat rushed from my chest to my ears. I tried to swallow, but my throat had gone dry. Blake wasn't finished. He kept going, voice relaxed, almost bored, like he was reading the weather. "I mean, come on, Courtney. Dropped out sophomore year, still lives alone in that tiny apartment. No health insurance, no 401k, jumping from one freelance gig to the next. Some of us moved forward, some of us didn't." Brooke jumped right in, touching his forearm like they were a comedy duo. "Baby nice. Maybe she's still figuring it out. Not everybody can handle a real job." She said real job the same way people say, "Bless your heart down here." Sweet on the surface, poison underneath. Mom dabbed her lips with her napkin and added almost gently, "We just worry, honey. You're 33. Blake was already engaged and buying his first house at your age." Dad nodded along, muttering something about stability and how the bank had great openings if I ever wanted to get serious. Blake snorted. "Yeah, because they're dying to hire someone who can't even finish a degree." He looked around the table for approval and got it. Brooke high-fived him under the table. Even Dad lifted his glass a little like it was a toast. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. The words were there, but they stuck behind my teeth. I could feel my pulse in my temples. All those years of them brushing off my Etsy sales, calling my graphic design work cute little projects, telling me I'd come crawling back once I ran out of savings. It all crashed down at once. Brooke leaned forward, fake concern all over her face. "Do you at least have savings? Like an emergency fund? Or is it just whatever Etsy pays this month?" She said it with this tiny laugh at the end, like the idea was ridiculous. Blake kept pushing. "Remember when she thought she was going to art school in New York and came home after one semester?" Classic Courtney. Start strong, quits when it gets hard. He shrugged like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Mom sighed in that disappointed way she's perfected and reached over to pat my hand. "We love you, sweetheart, but you make it so hard sometimes." Dad just shook his head again and took another bite of cobbler, chewing slowly, already moving on. Across from me, Hailey still hadn't moved. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. Now eyes moving from Blake to Brooke to our parents and back again. Not a flicker of surprise, not a flinch. Just watching. The laughter died down into that awkward quiet where everyone pretends they're suddenly very interested in dessert. Forks scraped plates. Ice clinked in glasses. Nobody looked at me anymore, like the joke was over and the show could go back to normal. I stared at my plate. Vision blurry, cheeks burning. Part of me wanted to stand up and walk out right then. Another part, the part that still remembered Christmas mornings and Mom's hugs when I was little, felt small and stupid for ever thinking tonight might be different. Blake finally broke the silence by asking Dad to pass the whipped cream, already bored with the whole thing. Brooke started scrolling her phone, showing Mom pictures from their trip to Gatlinburg last month, the two of them laughing again like nothing had happened. I sat there wondering how many more bites I had to take before I could politely leave the table. The silence stretched until Hailey reached for her water glass and set it down with a soft click. For the first time that evening, she spoke. Her voice came out calm and even cutting through the room like a knife through butter. "Interesting, because at this very moment I am locking the door reserved for all of you, and it will never open again." Nobody moved. Brooke's smile froze on her face. Blake's beer bottle hovered halfway to his mouth. Mom's napkin slipped from her fingers onto the plate. Dad stared at Hailey like she'd just spoken in another language. She didn't raise her voice or stand up dramatically. She just kept looking at them one by one, letting the words sink in. Then she added matter-of-factly, "By the way, I'm a co-founder of a fintech startup. We just closed our Series A round for $32 million last week." Blake choked on his beer and set the bottle down hard enough to slosh foam onto the table. "What the hell are you talking about? You work remote for that tech company in Atlanta. You're not some millionaire founder." Hailey tilted her head slightly, still completely composed. "I do work remote. For my own company. The app we built helps people manage their investments without fees. We started in my apartment 2 years ago, and now we have over 200,000 users. The investors came from Silicon Valley and New York. 32 million means we're expanding to Europe next year." Mom leaned forward, her voice shaky. "Hailey, honey, why didn't you tell us? That's wonderful." Hailey ignored her completely. She pushed her chair back and stood up slowly, smoothing her sweater like this was just another family dinner ending early. "Because you never asked. You never asked about my life, my work, anything that didn't revolve around Blake's promotions or Brooke's Instagram stories." Brooke stammered, "Wait, 32 million. Like dollars. You're serious?" Hailey nodded once. "Dead serious. And since you all think Courtney's the failure, you can figure out your own lives without us from now on." Blake shot up from his chair so fast it scraped against the hardwood floor. "This is bullshit. You're making this up to defend her. Prove it. Show me the email or the bank statement right now." Hailey reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen a few times and turned it around. There was the press release from TechCrunch headline clear as day. "Nashville fintech startup raises $32 million, Series A, led by Sequoia Capital." Her name was right there in bold as co-founder and CTO. Dad squinted at the screen, then looked up at her with wide eyes. "My God, Hailey. This is real." "It is," she said flatly. "And I'm done pretending we're a family that supports each other. You laugh at Courtney for building her graphic design business from scratch, but you ignore everything I've done. So now you get to do without both of us." Mom started crying, softly reaching out her hand. "Please don't do this. We're sorry." "We didn't mean." Hailey cut her off by turning away. She held out her hand to me. "Come on, Courtney, let's go." I stared at her hand for a second, my mind still spinning from everything she'd just said. Then I took it. Her grip was firm and steady, nothing like the quiet sister I thought I knew. Blake stepped in front of us, blocking the doorway to the living room. "You can't just drop this bomb and leave. We need to talk about this." Hailey looked him straight in the eye. "There's nothing left to talk about. Door's locked, remember?" She pulled me around him gently but firmly. We walked through the living room past the family photos on the mantel that suddenly looked like strangers. Mom followed us to the front door, still pleading. "Hailey, please. Courtney, tell her to stop." I didn't say anything. For the first time in years, I felt like I didn't have to. Hailey opened the door and we stepped out into the cool November air. The porch light flickered on automatically. She didn't look back once as we walked to her car parked in the driveway. Blake yelled from the doorway, "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Hailey unlocked the car and opened the passenger door for me. "Get in." I slid into the seat, still numb. She got behind the wheel and started the engine without a word. As we pulled out of the driveway, I could see Mom standing on the porch wiping her eyes with Dad and Blake behind her looking stunned. We drove down the quiet suburban street in silence for a few blocks. Streetlights cast long shadows on the lawns. Hailey finally glanced over at me and said softly, "You okay?" I nodded, though my hands were still shaking in my lap. "Yeah, thank you." She smiled that same small smile from earlier. About time someone said it. The city lights of Nashville started appearing as we got closer to the highway. For the first time all night, I felt like I could breathe. The second the front door clicked shut behind us, Mom and Dad came rushing out onto the porch. Mom reached for Hailey first, tears already streaming down her cheeks, voice cracking as she begged baby please come back inside. We can talk this out. You don't mean any of it. Dad stood right behind her, hands half raised like he wasn't sure whether to grab us or just stand there. His face had gone pale under the porch light. Hailey didn't slow down. She kept walking straight toward her car keys already in her hand, heels clicking on the concrete. I followed a step behind my own legs, moving on autopilot because my brain still hadn't caught up. Blake burst through the door next, Brooke right on his heels. He shouted across the yard. Hailey cut the crap. This isn't funny anymore. Get back in here. His voice carried that same tone he used when we were kids, and he wanted to prove he was in charge. Hailey didn't even turn around. She just kept going calm and steady like they were background noise. Dad took a few steps down the driveway. Hailey Bennett? You stop right there. We're your parents. His voice shook a little at the end, something I'd never heard from him before. Mom tried again, louder this time, almost hysterical. You can't just walk away from your family. What about Thanksgiving? What about Christmas? She was clutching the sleeve of Dad's shirt now, knuckles white. Brooke added from the porch, arms crossed. Yeah, really mature. Throw a tantrum and storm out because nobody clapped for your little app. Blake laughed short and bitter. Exactly. Come on, Hailey, you're not locking any doors. You're just pissed because Courtney got called out for once. Hailey reached the driver's side door and finally paused. She looked back over the roof of the car, expression completely blank. I'm not pissed, Blake. I'm done. There's a difference. Dad tried one more time, voice softer now, almost pleading. Sweetheart, $32 million or not, we're still your family. Money doesn't change that. Hailey opened the door and slid into the seat without answering him. She looked at me through the windshield and tilted her head toward the passenger side. I walked around the front of the car, legs still shaky, and got in. The interior smelled like her usual vanilla air freshener and the faint trace of coffee. Mom ran all the way to my window before I could close it, palms flat against the glass. Courtney, talked to her. Tell her to come back. Please. I looked at her hand, pressed there at the tears running down her face, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no guilt, just empty. I reached for the button and rolled the window up anyway. The second it sealed, Hailey put the car in reverse and backed out, smooth and slow. Blake stood in the middle of the driveway, waving his arms like he could physically stop us. You're both going to come crawling back when the money runs out, mark my words. Hailey didn't glance in the rearview mirror once. She just turned onto the main road and accelerated, the porch lights shrinking behind us until they disappeared. I sat there staring straight ahead, seatbelt cutting into my shoulder, heart still racing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably Mom or Dad, but I didn't check. Hailey reached over and gently took it from my hand, powered it off, and dropped it into the center console. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal when she changed lanes. I finally found my voice. You okay to drive? She nodded once. I'm good. Another mile passed. I watched the familiar suburbs give way to the brighter lights heading toward downtown Nashville. You didn't have to do that for me, I said quietly. Hailey kept her eyes on the road. I didn't do it for you. I did it for both of us. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. 17 months later, everything on their side had started to fall apart. The banking industry went through another brutal round of layoffs in early 2025. Blake's branch in Franklin got hit hard. First, they froze bonuses, then they cut salaries across the board by almost 30%. Blake kept telling everyone it was temporary, that his numbers were too good for them to let him go. 6 months after that, they let him go anyway. No severance package big enough to matter, just a cardboard box and a generic email. Around the same time, Dad went in for what he thought was just a stubborn cough. The doctor came back with the diagnosis most smokers fear: severe COPD. 30 years of 2 packs a day had finally caught up. The pulmonologist laid it out: plain oxygen concentrator at home, daily nebulizer treatments, medications that cost more than his old mortgage payment even after insurance. The out-of-pocket bills started piling up fast, 5 figures a year and climbing. Mom tried to keep the house running on Dad's disability checks and whatever part-time work she could pick up at the craft store, but it wasn't nearly enough. Blake and Brooke moved back into the old house to save money, which really meant the four of them were suddenly sharing one income and a mountain of medical debt. That was when the messages began. First, it was a long, apologetic text from Mom to both Hailey and me, asking if we could help out just this once with Dad's new inhaler that cost $800 a month. Then came the emails from Dad's account with subject lines like family emergency. Blake tried a different approach: voicemails left after midnight, voice thick with beer, saying things like the bank had screwed him over and he just needed a loan until he found something new. Brooke created a GoFundMe titled "Help Our Dad Breathe" and sent the link to every contact she could find in Hailey's old phone backups. Hailey read every single one, face completely blank, then blocked the numbers, the emails, the social accounts, one by one. She set up new filters so nothing from any of them ever reached her inbox again. When I asked if she felt anything reading them, she just shrugged and said she had felt enough the night she closed the door. I did the same. New phone number, private Instagram, everything locked down. The messages kept coming for a while anyway. Mom from a friend's phone asking about Thanksgiving. Blake through LinkedIn telling me I owed the family for abandoning Dad when he's dying. Even a letter in the actual mailbox, once Mom's handwriting on the envelope, thick with guilt and scripture quotes. I dropped it straight into the trash, unopened. They never got a single reply. Not $1, not one word. Meanwhile, Hailey's company kept growing. The $32 million turned into new offices downtown and a team of almost 100. She made Forbes 30 under 30 before she turned 30. My own graphic design work took off too. Regular clients became retainers. Retainers became 6-figure contracts. I finally moved out of the tiny apartment into a place with actual windows and a porch. Hailey bought a house in Green Hills. 2 months later, I bought one 10 minutes away. We started having Sunday dinners again, just the two of us and my boyfriend Mason Reed, who had quietly become the most steady part of my life. The old house, the old phone numbers, the old expectations, all of it stayed on the other side of a door that never reopened. By June 2026, our lives looked nothing like they had 2 years earlier. Mason Reed and I had turned the spare bedroom of my new house into a real design studio with dual monitors and proper lighting. Between the Etsy shop that now carried my own line of home prints and the freelance contracts with brands across the country, revenue crossed $800,000 in total over those 2 years. I still remember the day the accountant called and said the words, 7-figure gross, out loud. I just sat there staring at the spreadsheet, tears in my eyes, because nobody in the old house would ever believe it. Hailey's face ended up on the cover of Forbes 30 under 30 that spring. The headline called her the quiet architect of Nashville's next unicorn. She laughed when she saw it and immediately sent me a photo from the newsstand. 2 weeks later, she closed on a modern farmhouse in Green Hills with floor-to-ceiling windows and a pool. I closed on the house 10-minute drive-away cottage the same month. We jokingly called it our compound. On a perfect Saturday in June, under a white tent in my backyard strung with fairy lights, I married Mason in front of exactly 40 people. My closest design clients flew in from California and New York. Hailey stood beside me as maid of honor in a simple sage green dress, smiling bigger than I had ever seen. Mason's parents cried through the whole ceremony. Friends toasted with local whiskey and danced barefoot on the grass until the fireflies came out. Blake, Brooke, Mom, and Dad weren't invited. They didn't even know the wedding happened. I never posted a single picture publicly. Everything stayed on a private Instagram story that only approved followers could see. The old phone numbers were long gone. The street address was unlisted. The door Hailey locked that night stayed locked. We heard through a distant cousin that Blake was now driving for a rideshare app at night and living in a one-bedroom apartment with Brooke after the bank finally foreclosed on the house Dad grew up in. The medical debt had swallowed everything. Dad spends most days hooked to the oxygen tank in a rented recliner, too winded to leave the living room. Mom works double shifts at the craft store just to keep the lights on. They still try to reach us sometimes through random accounts or mutual acquaintances, but the messages never land. The wall is absolute. That evening in June, after the last guest left and the caterers packed up, Mason and I sat on the back steps with Hailey barefoot and exhausted and happy. Fireflies blinked across the yard. Hailey raised her champagne glass and said quietly to the people who never got a seat at the old table. We clinked plastic cups and drank. Here's the truth I want everyone listening to take away. Never ever underestimate the quiet one in the family. The person who sits back, watches, and says nothing is often the one building something unstoppable while everyone else is busy talking. That night taught me who my real family is, the people who show up, who celebrate without keeping score, who love without conditions. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very last word of this story. If any part of it hit home, if you've ever been the Courtney at the table, please drop a heart or share your own moment in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear that walking away is sometimes the strongest thing you can do, send them this series. We're all proof that the story doesn't end when they laugh. Sometimes that's exactly when it begins.